Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a disturbing trend, which is not just, of course, limited to the U.S., but is now global as well, and that trend of white supremacy, which is spreading. There has just been this case recently about a soldier who is part of a neo-Nazi cult and or adheres to some of their ideologies. That neo-Nazi cult specifically based in the UK by the name of I'll look for the name just for a moment, UK's Order of Nine Angles. And this soldier essentially was going to rat out his own unit and give its locations, etc., to this cult to attack. Now, this cult itself, within it, has an interesting ideology where it's both white supremacist and also, in some ways, assigns onto the ideology of the likes of Al-Qaeda and others. So there is a bit of confusion there at a mix. But overall, when we're looking at the State Department and its recent statements about white supremacy, it's obviously brought attention to this issue for a while now, as has the FBI. And white supremacy is now on the rise, according to the State Department, and is now spreading geographically as well. That's an exact quote from their latest report. And then we also have concerns not just, as I said, limited to the U.S., but also in Germany, where we've had a number of arrests of neo-Nazis and white supremacists there as well. We know the Halle synagogue attack was carried out by a white supremacist, and there have been many such arrests, and of course concerns now growing in Germany as well, as in with other parts of the world. We can point back to the Christchurch attacks in New Zealand, etc., etc. Let's bring all of that up with our panelists who are joining us now. We're now joined by Mark Briskey, who is a senior lecturer in criminology at Murdoch University School of Law and Criminology. He's joining us now from Perth in Western Australia. Joining us from Cambridge in the UK is Bethan Johnson, who is a doctoral fellow at the Centre for Analysis of the Radical Right. Bethan and Mark, thank you both for your time today. Mark, let me start with you. We have this case coming out of the US, right, where this soldier essentially was going to rat out his group and give information, sensitive information about his unit when they were to be deployed overseas. What do you think pushes someone to be able to do that to their own unit? Because, you know, within the military especially, it's sort of ingrained in you, isn't it, to be protective of your own unit?
Absolutely, Waqar. Within the military, it's one of the underpinning elements of solidity that you would literally die for your fellow soldier. What's occurring here is that people who have been radicalised into this far-right worldview are offering their allegiance to what they see as an ideology in which the world should operate as to their views. And we've seen this in the United States, in Europe, and here in Australia, where, of course, the Christchurch massacre you referred to was committed by a person who their radical right-wing ideology was incubated right here in Australia.
And, you know, it's kind of worrying, isn't it, that a lot of these far-right extremists, they want violence to occur, right? So even Ethan Melzer, who is this soldier, the U.S. soldier who's now being charged with this crime, he said that he would want that to be his legacy, another 10 years of war, for example, in the Middle East. That's an exact quote from what he said when he was caught. That's disturbing, isn't it?
So you have within the spectrum that is the radical right or the far right, individuals who are not necessarily adhering to the ideas of political change through constitutional methods or sort of voting in individuals who believe in what they do, but in fact believe they want to accelerate the process of disintegration of society through violence. So they want radical change and they believe violence is the way to do it. And orders like the one that Melzer is part of and others, they believe that pushing the system to the extreme using violence is the best method to get the end result that they want. So violence is something that is very fundamental to their belief system and their sort of practices, and is something that they will engage with and for a long time to come. I don't think that's going to change because it's so fundamental to their approach to political change.
And obviously none of this helped, is it, Mark, through politicians and a lot of the rhetoric that we're seeing coming out. So we can't just point at Donald Trump, but we've had the rhetoric, even if we're completely honest, from Boris Johnson and even some politicians in Australia, for example. We've also had the Hungarian Prime Minister and his points of view about immigrants, et cetera, and many, many others, of course, that we can point to around the world. All of that, I imagine, plays a huge factor in this.
Absolutely. When people see across the world, as you referred to, whether it's Viktor Orban in Hungary or the Vox Party and their electoral successes last year, and indeed here in Australia, where you have the current ruling government had a vote preference deal with Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party, who are absolutely vocally racist and periodically promote the most vile rhetoric, which unfortunately, because of the legitimacy the people in her party and linked parties get, it's seen as some sort of legitimisation and smudging of the barriers of acceptability in rhetoric. And she seems to be, whilst not overly as popular as she used to be, there's enough influence with these people and watch the hateful rhetoric that she spruiks, that it is influential. And as you said, with Orban and the whole premise underneath Brexit and a whole range of other similar politicians around the world, this is giving people their legitimacy in which they feel they can even go one step further.
So then, Bethan, do you think that, for example, politicians in the UK now realize that they need to tone back their rhetoric and that this may be playing a part, for example, in the rise of the far right just within the context of the UK too?
I think to an extent that is true. I think that particular parties have been called out by their opposition parties for the rhetoric that they're using as being dangerous to sort of Britain First policies, as having deeply problematic racial tones to them, anti-refugee, anti-immigrant, and how that helps the far right sort of normalize the approach and the rhetoric that they use towards non-white Britons. So I think that there has been, to a certain extent, some degree of reckoning for using that kind of rhetoric, but we shouldn't be overly optimistic about the fact that Britain has eradicated this from political speech. It's still very much on our streets in mainstream politics, as well as sort of extremist groups as well. So there still needs to be more to be done.
Indeed. And I meant, Mark, that a huge role has to be played by media, right? Where it's been argued for a while now, and I'm sure you've heard this argument, that there's been double standards when we're talking about terrorism, right? Overall, where if it's quote unquote Islamist terrorism, as it's been called many times, then that's given, wall-to-wall coverage in media. But then when it's far-right terrorism, in general, of course, and I'm generalizing here, it's not given as much coverage. Do you think that media is also now possibly going to reform itself?
Well, I'd like to say they would, but you've just got to look online at a number of the media providers to see that there's still a strong attraction to salacious stories where people such as, for instance, in Australia, Pauline Hanson will come out with these very dreadful statements and some of them across their hybrid racism. In many cases, they're addressed to not only Muslims, but they're addressed to black African immigrants. They're addressed to other immigrant groups or any group that's seen as threatening the supporters of these parties, such as Pauline Hanson in Australia, who they believe is a threat to their idea of the perfect white society. We saw here last year in Australia the Fraser Anning, who thankfully got tipped out in the last federal election, but using Nazi-type language, final solution in regards Muslims. So these people, unfortunately, still attract an excessive amount of media attention purely because the outrageousness of some of their comments.
And I imagine a lot of the media does use this double standard to an extent because of what the population sort of is comfortable, right? So I imagine it's about delivering what the people want, and if in the people's minds one type of terrorism is more to be worried about than the other, then that's what the media will deliver?
To an extent, that's true. I think certain countries or certain media outlets are being more responsible in how they report the news, at least some of the outlets in certain countries. So you're seeing a trend in refusing to name or show the pictures of individuals who are perpetrating far-right attacks, or not naming some of the books that they've read that were sort of central to their ideology so that people can't go online and look for them. So there's some degree of media reform in that way, I would say. But I do think there is a degree to which the media is beholden to what they believe their audience wants. And so that shifts the narrative to some extent. So we also, as consumers of news, need to be really critical about how reporters approach these stories to make sure they're doing them in responsible ways. So we get the information we need about the attack as it's occurring and the motivations behind it without venerating it in any way or normalizing the sort of rhetoric behind it. So there needs to be a push and a pull in terms of people need to know that this is a threat, and they need to know what's going on, but they need to know in a responsible way.
Yeah, okay, I wanted to come back full circle to the military for a moment, aspect of all of this, because it's worrying where I was just reading a report about how within the U.S., on a weekly basis almost for the past couple of months, one soldier or another has been found to have far-right views of some sort, right? And that's just the U.S. I imagine if that sort of a study was done in other countries as well, possibly we may have similar results also. That's worrying because a lot of these men and women serve abroad, right, in countries where then you would have the people that they're meant to be protecting being those very people who they possibly dislike a lot because of their ideology. What do you make of that?
Yes, that's something that's that we can see that's been occurring in a number of militaries. Here in Australia, the Chief of Defence a few years ago undertook an investigation into a cabal of far-right officers who were actively pushing quite a misogynistic, sexist and racist in-house form of communication between them. But it is especially worrying when soldiers, especially with countries such as Australia and the United States and European countries, are sent on peacekeeping missions where you could have officers and men and women who subscribe to these beliefs. Just here in the last few months, for instance, and I'm not saying it's got anything to do with racism per se, but there's been a very high-profile investigation into the Australian Special Forces in regards a number of incidents in Afghanistan where it's apparent that people have been summarily tortured and shot. Now, of course, we've only got to go back to even the Iraq conflict, and when you start calling up large groups of reservists or whoever who might also be hold memberships in these groups, and it becomes apparent that within certain individuals these beliefs are strongly held.
Indeed, and Bethan, you know, on that of accountability in militaries, right? Just the UK just, I believe, wrapped up an investigation which it called independent, right, into its own soldiers' actions in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and it's essentially give them, said that they'll all be free in the sense that they will not be charged with any crimes, and that doesn't that, and I imagine at some level, give fodder again to this sort of ideology where you can almost get away with any crime if you have committed it. I'm not saying, of course, those soldiers did 100% commit those crimes. We need to see the evidence, but nevertheless, that sort of message would still then be received by those who would want to see that on the far right.
Yeah, so the far right has a really interesting relationship with the military in general. So I think military is an interesting case insofar as being an active member of the military, whilst also holding these beliefs. There is a push to have individuals who are still in military service be part of these groups so that they can gain the training that they would need to potentially carry out attacks after deployments, etc., or do what Melzer has done. But at the same time, a lot of these groups are also accelerationists. They're anti-institutional. They don't like the government. So it's an interesting debate. So to some extent, they will be following determinations like what you've just mentioned and saying, this is interesting. Maybe the UK government's position on how it treats people overseas is different than we had figured. But at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily ascribe this is a sort of major victory for them in any way ideologically, because they are fundamentally believing that Britain is a multicultural society, and the stance that is taken on immigration and refugees is something that is so problematic that they want to overthrow the government. So to a certain extent, they're not looking to the government for permission or for sort of acceptance in that way, or to be led by the government and their stance on anything. They really are trying to fundamentally overthrow the whole system.
All right, so then I'll give you the final word before I let you both go. As far as overthrowing, governments and creating chaos and violence, that seems to be the goal, right? As I'd put to Bethan earlier as well, on the part of even what's called the Boogaloo movement, I believe, in the US. They want to create strife and almost like a civil war within societies. Do you think to an extent that sort of polarization will succeed?
I don't think it will succeed. It's certainly been prominent in the United States, especially where you have militia groups, and even in the recent Black Lives Matter protests where you had persons apparently in some of the western states of the US believing there was an imminent Antifa invasion. But these people, as Bethan said, some of them subscribe to an eclectic mix of accelerationism, where let's bring on the conflict as soon as possible. Some wish to try and change the government to their beliefs, whereas others, as Bethan also said, are very much in the mould of they see the government as part of this Zog Zionist occupational government or similar versions of that narrative. They wish to have a world on their terms, this sentimental return to what they believe was the perfect white order. So, and the government doesn't fit that in Western governments, where we promote multiculturalism and multiracialism. They will try, and here in Australia, our Internal Security Service just recently warned of the heightened risk of persons wishing to attack government agencies. So they see the government as being complicit in this recreating of a society that they don't wish to be part of.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final. We really appreciate both Mark and Bethan for their time today, and of course for their expert insight and shedding light on this issue for us within the context that we should all understand it in. Because it seems that for a very long time, right, we've been speaking about the far-right threat, but it seems that governments have been very slow to react. We now finally have proper research, and of course, a lot of the kinds of experts that we had on today in our show have been researching this issue for a while now, but it only seems to be coming to the fore now, recently. Where, of course, a lot of these people have been talking about this for a while and have been warning that this is going to get worse, where these sorts of extremists want violence within their own societies, even within and against their own military units. I mean, that takes a certain level of extremism, really, in one's mind, where you'd want to hurt your own military servicemen within your own unit, and that you would rat out their own locations where you could possibly be harming yourself too, if an attack, God forbid, were to occur. So we need to A, understand the ideology, and B, we need to deal with it. But it seems media and politicians in many parts of the world are not willing to deal with it. And in fact, their rhetoric is the one that actually very much plays into the hands of these sorts of extremists as well. I'll be back with my next segment after this. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Syria. And the U.S. ambassador, the U.S. envoy for Syria, has said that we are not demanding total victory, i.e. the United States is not demanding total victory, i.e. also saying that we are not saying that Bashar al-Assad has to go. That was Ambassador James Jeffrey speaking. He went on to say that Washington does, though, want to see a dramatic shift in the behavior of the regime vis-a-vis the world and vis-a-vis, of course, its own people. Now, this is different from the initial goal of the United States, where it wanted the ouster of Bashar al-Assad, but it seems in recent times that the U.S. has changed that stance. However, at the same time, we also have the Caesar Act being enforced, where sanctions are now being placed on Bashar al-Assad, as well as his inner circle and his external supporters as well, and countries that supported, that trade with his government, etc. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Taleb Ibrahim, who is a political analyst joining us from the Syrian capital, Damascus. We're also joined by Yahya Al-Aridi, who is a member of the Syrian Negotiations Commission. He's joining us now from Strasbourg in France. Yahya and Taleb, thank you both for your time today. Yahya, let me start with you. What do you make of the statement of the U.S. ambassador? How much of a different stance is this from previous U.S. positions on Syria?
Well, so far, the U.S. position towards the regime apparently is negative. We do not expect with this statement made by Mr. James Jeffrey to be a sudden fall in love with the regime. When they say that we want the regime, we don't want to change the regime, we want to change its behavior. Actually, we know and everybody knows that the regime and its behavior are one and the same. If the behavior changes, automatically the regime changes, because the position of atrocities, destruction, displacement of people, imprisonment of Syrians, all these things are part of and parcel of the regime's nature. The moment they change, it ceases to exist. And this is not only a message to the regime, it is a message to those who support the regime, in particular the Iranians and the Russians. This is the situation, and I don't believe that any change in the American position is there, especially with the implementation of the Caesar law.
Yeah.
And this Caesar law, as you know, was signed 6 months ago. And there was 6 months between the signing and the actual implementation of the law. The regime, in other words, was given 6 months to react, to behave, to do something towards these things, these issues in the law that would change its behavior towards its people, like releasing prisoners, joining the peace process, lifting the siege from areas, letting committees investigate prisons, all these things. Nothing has happened. It seems that the regime is going to utilize this law in order to oppress Syrian people more.
All right, so let me bring in Taleb. Taleb, what are your thoughts about the U.S. position when it comes to Syria, especially when it comes to, the U.S. saying they don't need Bashar al-Assad to go, but just change his behavior, and then at the same time, there's also those sanctions which are being placed?
I think this is senseless, because United States couldn't topple Assad, and they tried for about 9 years, and they couldn't achieve anything. I don't think that the United States now an important player in Syria, and I don't see any change in American position in respect with Syria. But if you look what the United States wants from Syria, what we know from our experience in the Syrian-American relations, that United States of America has no American policy in Middle East. They have only Israeli policy, which is being implemented and done by United States. If you look at the so-called Caesar law, by the end, they want a political process with Israel, and they want Iran to go out of Syria, and all of those are are Israeli demands in need. I don't think that the pressure on the regime in the behalf to achieve more steps in the behalf of Syrian people or to bring democracy or freedom to Syrian people. Indeed, they want only to guarantee the security of Israel and to guarantee a kind of surrender to Israel. At this point, the regime will be a very good regime, and it will be legislative, and all things will be very, very good from the American point of view. Otherwise, if the regime will continue in its policy against Israel, it will be from the side of America, it will be a bad regime, and they will consider it illegal, and etc., etc. The main problem here in the American policy that the United States does not want what to do in Syria, and many American policymakers recognize that they haven't an American strategy in Syria. Indeed, yes, that's true. They have Israeli strategy in Syria, and they have Turkish strategy in Syria. They couldn't topple Assad, and now they want to make a deal with him, and I think this is impossible at any way.
Okay, so Yahya, just on the point of the ouster of Bashar al-Assad, right, and the fall of the regime as the goal that was initially stated in the earlier days of this crisis in Syria, can we agree that that has failed? And do you think that that is a failure of the U.S. policy?
Well, let me just look back at particular things which were said.
Sure.
When we talk about these issues raised in the Caesar law, are dictated by Israel. Actually, we are against the logic. Conflict actually is not between this regime and Israel. Israel attacks almost every day, and the regime does nothing at all. And the conflict actually is between this regime and the people. And the law itself calls upon the regime to change its behavior towards its own people, because it is called the Protection of Syrian People Law. This is what it is. Now, the pretext and always these excuses that this regime is in conflict with Israel, it is steadfast and it is resisting, etc., etc., it is doing nothing towards these things that they talk about. Actually, the nature and the substance of the conflict is between people who want freedom and a regime who wants to oppress and suppress them. This is the issue, and this is the reason behind this law. We are not fond of the United States, and the United States is not fond of Syria, but international legality, international issues, human law, etc., dictates on powers to do something about a tragedy that has been going on for years. This is the issue, actually. Now, the United States said that this law could be lifted, or the impact of this law could cease if these things are done. One of these things is to stop killing people, to let prisoners go illegally in prison, to join the peace process. These things seem to be very difficult for a regime that has set for itself from the very beginning, either I rule Syria or I ruin it. The regime has ruined Syria, and it is still ruling it. You cannot have it both ways. Okay. There has to be time for peace. There has to be time for Syrians to feel like normal human beings, and for Syria to go back to life. This is the issue, not any other thing, not this upside down logic that because they have a conflict with Iran. What is Iran doing in Syria in the first place? Fighting Israel? Let it fight Israel from Iran. What is Russia doing? They are protecting this oppressive regime. This is the issue. Syrians want freedom. This is the issue.
Okay, so let me go to Taleb with that. Taleb, that's a good point, isn't it? Because whatever we may say, there are some legitimate human rights concerns when it comes to the Syrian government, and I'm talking about the government of Bashar al-Assad right now. Do you think that the government has been able to deal with those concerns about human rights, how it deals with its own people?
There were a lot of amnesty decrees released by President Assad in the 5 past years. But what about 200,000 of foreign fighters from Germany, from France, from Afghanistan, from all around the world, who were driven and brought to Syria by the American intelligence? I don't think that freeing the people in Syria and making democracy and making equality between all the people of Syria should be achieved by terrorism or by a Nusra Front and by others. And he will be a madman who believes that United States of America wants to bring democracy of Syria to Syria. We have seen what had happened in Iraq. We have seen what had happened in Libya. The United States project for all the region is to bring more and more terrorism, more and more blood, destroy all the national states. Who destroyed Syria? The opposition, indeed, who began this bad process and who said that, yes, we will go to the battle with the regime and the regime will fall in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And after that, what had happened? They destroyed Syria. Indeed, yes, all of us as a Syrian, we want freedom, we want democracy, we want human rights, and we recognize that. And we are working for that. But how to achieve that? Should we achieve that by launching a civil war inside Syria?
So Taleb, if I may come in for a moment, I don't want to argue on your points. What I'm finding is that we're all agreeing that we need a peace process, right? So why doesn't, Taleb, the government come forward of Bashar al-Assad and enter into a proper peace process with the other side?
I think they will do, and they tried to do, but there were preconditions from some parties. And when some of my friends who joined the Syrian delegation for the negotiation with the opposition, they said that they weren't talked to them. They were dictations from the United States. If we leave Syria for Syrians and raise all hands of Syria, and at that point, I think that it's very, very much possible to see a real and a confidential and trustworthy peace process inside Syria, which will lead to a real political and peaceful settlement to the conflict inside Syria.
Yahya, let me go to you with this then, because we, as I said to Taleb, we agree that there needs to be a peace process. But then tell me, why has a peace process not succeeded? Why are we not seeing peace talks right now as we speak?
Very quick point about the United States.
Sure.
Syrians are not fond of the United States, and we know that it is not a friend, as I said, with Syrians. It doesn't care about democracy. It has just did all sorts of atrocities all over the world. And nobody is waiting for the United States to rescue Syrians, but at least for international purposes, for being a superpower, it has to do its duty in light of the UN Security Council resolutions. Another thing on terrorism actually was used as a pretext by the regime in order to justify its killing of its people. This is the point. Who released all those Satans and savage people from the Fednaya prisons, and they became the leaders of Daesh? Who had connections with Al-Qaeda, which was whose base is in Iran, and all these things. So they are no more applicable, no more marketable. Another thing with regard to the peace process, from the very beginning, the regime has rejected the peace process. It just weaseled out and it used all kinds of tricks in order to run away from it. It was, whenever it came to Geneva, it was by the force of Russia, because Russia did all what it did militarily, and it didn't get anything at the political level. It pressured the regime and pushed it towards Geneva. It tried to save it through the Astana track. It didn't succeed. The Geneva was the only track, and it came to Geneva through the Constitutional Committee, and from the very beginning, they said that this is the other side or the other party, the opposition. The Negotiations Commission is a Turkish delegation. I don't think that we are Turkish. We are Syrians more than anybody else. This is a very important point. This is a weapon always using the issue of patriotism, as if you cease to be patriotic when you kill your own people. This is a very important criterion they just forget about. Actually,
okay.
The other delegation wants to implement Resolution 2254, want to get into the peace process through the Constitutional Committee door, and there has to be implementation of that resolution, the Geneva Communiqué, in order for a political change to take place and for Syria to come back to life.
All right, so Taleb, I'm trying to again come to common ground here. So let's talk about the Constitutional Committee, right, as a possibility and a way forward. What are your thoughts about the Constitutional Committee as a possible path towards eventual peace?
I think yes, it's very important to do that, and the Constitution of Syria, which is now working, it is not a sacred text. Indeed, we can discuss it, and I think the government and even President Assad is an open man, and he wants to get rid of this war which destroyed everything in Syria. All Syrian families lost some of its members in this war, and the solution should be that the Constitutional Committee might be one of the important elements to do the political process. It is not the complete political process. And I think by the end we must find a kind of deal and agreement between regional powers and international powers in which they will work to achieve peace and security in Syria, because there are a lot of geostrategic issues which are related to the situation in Syria. By the end of the way, I don't think that Syria is isolated from its regional atmosphere or from the international atmosphere. But the interventions inside Syria from all regional and international players made the country reach the hill indeed. And we hope that we will get rid of that very, very quickly.
All right, Yahya, I'll give you the final word. Again, I was trying to come to common ground there on this issue of the Constitutional Committee, because we can all agree, I think, that that's an important path forward, right? Do you think that that there's some hope there, there's some light at the end of that tunnel?
Okay, let me start reaching common grounds by addressing my brother Taleb in Damascus. I'm in France. I used to be the dean of a School of Media and Communication. He's a doctor, and I know him, he knows me, and we want Syria to come back to life. I understand. Down deep, I don't know how much he believes in what he is saying in this propaganda of the regime. I was part of this media of the regime, but I'm just in full harmony with myself. Now, I want Syria, and he wants Syria to come back to life. He doesn't like to have atrocities. He doesn't approve of them. And we should come to these common grounds as Syrians and save our country. This is not the job of the United States. It's not the job of anybody. He knows that terrorism was used as a pretext. He knows that Iran and Russia came to the rescue of the regime, not to the rescue of Syrian people. What I care about is the Syrian people who have been displaced all over the world, whose country is destroyed, half of it is destroyed. 500,000 people are still in jail. You know those pictures, 55,000 pictures taken by so-called Caesar to the world, people tortured and dying in prisons. This is what we should care about. This is the common ground we should come to and save our country.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word, but we appreciate both Yahya and Taleb for this discussion. I know it's a very tough topic to talk about. It's very sensitive, and there are important issues on both sides to discuss very openly, but nevertheless, we appreciate both of them for their time and for their such insight as well, because it makes the context and it makes the conversation that much richer. Now, when it comes to the situation in Syria and the U.S. role within Syria, on day one, essentially, of the crisis, the U.S. wanted Bashar al-Assad out. There's no qualms about that. But now the Americans are saying, okay, we don't need Bashar al-Assad out. We just want him to reform his ways. And one of the ways that the U.S. wants Bashar al-Assad, apparently, to reform his ways, according to what they believe he should be doing, is through the Caesar Act, right? Now, of course, there's arguments on both sides for and against the regime. I don't want to get into that, but it's just about the U.S. role at this point in time. Can it play a positive role within that country? Has it ever played a positive role? As both of our guests essentially agreed, it hasn't. Syrians do not like the United States and do not want it to be involved in it, or in its affairs, I should say. So essentially, it's about Syrians resolving the Syrian issues themselves. And as both of our guests, both of them Syrians, disagree quite openly on what needs to be done. Nevertheless, it's Syrians talking to Syrians. And that's the way it should be when it comes to these issues. And that's why we need a peace process to move forward, be it via the Constitutional Committee or other such ways. But even these tough discussions need to be happening between Syrians themselves in closed rooms where they can hammer out what should happen with their country. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.